Sam Darnold is an NFC champion, but it's not like the Vikings could have had him in the building, right? Uh-oh.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, where we're always trying to learn something new. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, the #1 sports podcasting network. And today on the show, I want to talk about regret. I think we're all feeling it. There's a big Vikings fandom-wide conversation about Sam Darnold especially, but there's a lot of former Vikings going around that are going to be playing in a couple weeks that are were on the team not that long ago. They had these guys in the building, and now they're off finding success elsewhere. Woe is us, right? Well, that's not what I'm going to do today. And by the way, we're not going to do this all day later in the show. I do want to discuss Brian Flores. He didn't get the Steelers job, so what that means and some of the defensive needs as well. But firstly, here's the situation, right? Sam Darnold, 14-3 season last year, fails in the playoffs. The Vikings say we're going with the young guy. He goes off to free agency, and now they have won the NFC. Another 14-win season, an inarguably better team than last year's Vikings, I would say this year's Seahawks are, and trip to Santa Clara. Like, what are we going to do there, right? And what you're not going to find on this show, there's plenty of talk radio out there, I'm sure, that will give you, oh, woe is us, oh no, the Vikings did it again, oh darn, oh facepalm, and just like whinging and whining. That's not what I'm going to do here. I think you can take a situation that looks pretty bad and come at it from all the angles and come up with something more productive than that. And it's just me. I don't like regret. I am not a person in my life that lives with a lot of like regret. Like when something goes bad, when I make the wrong decision, my reaction isn't to lament. It's to try to learn something. We're always trying to learn something new here on Locked On Vikings. So this is just the way that I approach stuff like this. Okay, they misstepped here. They had a fork in the road. They chose the wrong path. Why? What can you do about it? What can you do to prevent it in the future? I think those are better questions than how bad does this feel, y'all? Hey, you're cold, right? I'm cold too. Like it just feels very woe is me and whiny. And that's just not what I'm going to be. So let's answer those questions. Why did they make that decision? It's probably worth it to relive why they made that decision, right? Well, coming off of the debacle of the Rams game, 31-9, I think was the final score. Darnold takes 9 sacks. He turns the ball over a bunch, and the Vikings completely collapse. They get punched in the mouth against the Lions, and they just do not recover, and they totally no-show in the playoffs. And Sam Darnold took a lot of the blame for that. And he had I think he should take some share of the blame for that, but he maybe took too much. But I don't think that that's really the way it was in the building. Remember, the Vikings did like Sam Darnold. And what I won't abide is the idea that they went, get out of here. They like hand waved him off and shooed him out the building. No. He had a 1-year deal. He had an understanding, I'm going to guess, thanks to a lot of tampering, like what always happens. I'm going to guess that his agent understood that he was going to get a multi-year deal from someone out there. Maybe they even knew it was the Seahawks, and that is not abnormal, even though it's technically against the rules, so don't get mad about it. But when making decisions about whether or not to sign what the Vikings offered him, which was, if I recall, competitive with the average annual value of the Seahawks contract. They didn't lowball him, and they didn't say we don't want you anymore. They said, we'll bring you back for 1 year and we're going to give you all this money. And he said, I can get 3 years somewhere else. Sorry, no. And he did. I think everybody in that interaction is perfectly above board. I think that's all totally fine. So the answer to the question why they didn't bring back Sam Darnold isn't it's not that they thought he was a bad quarterback. They thought that he was a short-term quarterback. They wanted, I think they were maybe worried a little bit that it was lightning in a bottle, and they were wrong about that. And more so, they would have had to commit long-term a year after drafting a quarterback in the top 10. Now, I just don't think you're going to see a lot of teams do that. Even if it's the correct thing to do, it's just not something I'm going to see a lot of teams steer completely off course that way, especially after what felt like it could have very well been a flash in the pan and it didn't even end well. And I think a big reason for it was that you didn't trust how he was going to play in the playoffs, right? He just had one playoff game and it was a disaster. How do we know he's not just going to, fall apart in the playoffs again? And so that's why I reserved a lot of judgment. I didn't talk about this a lot over the year, even though, one of the prevailing stories was Sam Darnold looks great, JJ McCarthy doesn't, because I was like, let me see what happens in the postseason, because that was a huge reason. And now that he has played well in the postseason, all of this is I think, fair game. So, okay, they didn't want a long-term commitment to Sam Darnold. Again, at watching him, win the NFC and hold up a trophy is like, okay, well, maybe, the Vikings haven't done that since Jimmy Carter was president. So like maybe a long-term commitment to Sam Darnold wasn't the worst idea. But the process by which they came to that conclusion, I must remind you, was one man's opinion was the only one that mattered. And that was Kevin O'Connell. And so if you want to look at it from everyone's perspective and ask, where did you go wrong, right? If you want to look at Kwesi, and I've already seen people say, wow, Kwesi made this terrible quarterback decision. He should be fired over it. But his decision was to trust the QB whisperer in the room. The Vikings in their building right now have one of the most trusted QB voices in all of the NFL. Maybe the most trusted quarterback voice in all of the NFL. One of the guys that knows the position the best, and everybody in the whole league, whether they're in the Vikings or not, is going to corroborate that. I don't think I'm on a limb there. And so if another QB decision has to happen, should Kwesi say, sorry, Kevin, you botched the JJ McCarthy thing. I'll make this decision this time. I'll listen to your input, but this one's going to be my decision. Should he do that? Or if, many of you get your wish and Kwesi gets unceremoniously the boot next time there's a quarterback decision, but O'Connell's still in the building, should the new GM be like, nah, sorry, dude, I'm making the decision? And shut the most respected QB mind out the door? I don't know. Or should we maybe rethink how respected of a QB mind Kevin O'Connell is? Because he utterly failed to develop JJ McCarthy, him and his staff by proxy, utterly failed at this decision to evaluate the quarterbacks in his building, even though JJ McCarthy was like active in some meetings, and it made them so excited that they didn't want a long-term commitment to an under 30 quarterback that was playing at an MVP level and continued to. What talked Kevin O'Connell into that? So if you want to shift to O'Connell's perspective on this, the guy who was given all of the power, he was given the blank check. Whatever you say, dude, we are going to do at quarterback. That was publicly announced that was how they were going to do it. And I don't know if there is any reporting to the contrary. It is the truth that Kevin O'Connell made this decision, and the Wilfs, Kwesi, everybody else respected that. So if you look at it from O'Connell's perspective and said he was in love with JJ McCarthy, just like any head coach is with the first guy they draft, right? Leslie Frazier got fired sticking to Christian Ponder. Mike Zimmer is mad to this day that the Vikings didn't stick with Teddy Bridgewater. Never try to separate a head coach from the guy they drafted first. So with all that in mind, and that seeming inability to have an honest dialogue about JJ McCarthy, and even some of the reporting out of camp was like, there's this weird like emperor has no clothes thing on where he's like struggling, but nobody wants to talk about it. And with all of that in mind, next time there is a QB decision, assuming Kevin O'Connell still has this job when that happens, should they give him carte blanche again? I super doubt that they will, because he bungled this. If you say the Vikings bungled this, you are saying Kevin O'Connell bungled this because he was judge, jury, and executioner on that decision. And for where the Wilson Kwesi went wrong, because they were really part and parcel in this, is giving Kevin O'Connell that power. Should they do it again? I think is an interesting question. But if I am to try to, process through this feeling of regret, this seller's remorse, into something productive for the team, it's to raise that question. It's to say, hey, do the right people have the right power in this organization? Are the right people making the right decisions? And I don't think that they are. I don't think you can say that they are, considering how relatively little success Kevin O'Connell has had in now 4 seasons as head coach, heading into his 5th. they've won a lot of regular season games, but they haven't won a playoff game yet. And he's now, I think, the longest tenured coach in the league without a playoff win. This has been a very up and down time. And this particular decision was always going to be the one where the O'Connell and Adolfo-Mensah era was judged. And it's looking right now like it's a disaster, but that's only right now. There is still, this was a 3-year decision, not a 1-year decision. So however it looks in the first year, the next 2 will also play just as important of a role. And that's a different angle to this that I think warrants a little bit more discussion. So we'll get into that and then some of the stuff about Flores and the defense on Locked On Vikings. Today's episode of Locked On Vikings is brought to you by PrizePicks. The big game is now coming up. Patriots, Seahawks, and there's no better way to stay locked into every moment than with PrizePicks, the daily fantasy app where it always feels good to be right. With football season coming down to its final stretch, now is the perfect time to close it out strong. PrizePicks is incredibly easy to get started. Pick 2 or more players and choose more or less on their player projections. You can pick whatever you want, from regular stats, yards, and touchdowns to sacks, interceptions, fantasy points, all kinds of weird stuff. You can pick just the former Vikings like Darnold and Diggs. You can do something else. You can pick multiple stats for the same player and stack them up. You can get an early payout, which lets you cash out if a player gets off to a hot start. And the new social feed makes it fun to follow friends, share lineups, and get inspiration from other players. Download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 in lineups when you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 in lineups after your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, it's good to be right. Today's episode is also brought to you by Robinhood. What if sports were traded like markets? Now you can put your sports IQ to work in real time with Robinhood prediction markets. It's not you against the house, it's you participating in a live market. You can buy or sell your positions live all game long. Use your sports knowledge in the moments that matter. Robinhood prediction markets changes the game. It's people moving the action. So when momentum shifts, you can move with it. I always knew the game, but never had a dynamic way to apply that knowledge. Now I can actually take part live in a market powered by the people. You are no longer just a spectator. Play by play, you decide. Trade every play with Robinhood. Now available across the U.S. Download the Robinhood app now to begin. Futures and cleared swaps trading involves significant risk and is not appropriate for everyone. Event contracts are offered by Robinhood Derivatives LLC, a registered futures commission merchant and swap firm. Thanks so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day every single day. And if you are an everydayer and you want to go ad-free, you can with the Locked On Vikings Everydayer Club. Go to lockedonvikings.supercast.com and you can get Locked On Vikings episodes ad-free for $5 a month or $50 a year, plus access to a special Discord server where all of the Locked On hosts are hanging out and much more. Let's look more at the long term here with this whole decision that we're now relitigating, which is not my favorite thing to do, by the way. So I'm not going to talk about this all off season. You can, I'm sure you can find plenty of shows that would love to fill 3 weeks of airtime with this so that they don't have to think. That was a little catty. Okay. Don't do that. Don't do that. Moving to the long term here of this like Sam Darnold thing. So when the Vikings made their decision, they made the decision not about I'm choosing Sam Darnold over JJ McCarthy even at all necessarily. They were choosing the idea of 1 year of Sam Darnold versus 3. So they were choosing another 1 year rental. They wanted the option to be able to get rid of Sam Darnold or to let him walk if it did turn into be lightning in a bottle, right? What if it wasn't? And they didn't know what this was at the time. And that might be part of what we critique here is that Sam Darnold was excelling with them all year and they couldn't tell the difference between a Case Keenum one-hit wonder and this. And they couldn't tell that these things were different. And I think we can really critique that. I think you can look at everybody in the building from Kwesi to O'Connell to all of the people on their staffs and say, how come you couldn't tell that this wasn't going to work out long term? How come you needed to hedge that bet and say, well, we'll bring it back 1 year at a time, and we really want to make sure that this is actually working. We're a little scared still. And we've got this guy under contract for 4 years that we're really excited about, so we're going to go with him. So we're going to go with him in the long term, right? So you could say, if you wanted to be really, really charitable to the Vikings, you could say, well, they did want him for 2026, but they didn't want him for 2027. So let's see what happens in 2027. I don't think I can go there. I think it's a little bit too cope. But if it does fall apart for the Seattle Seahawks in the next couple of years, and lots of things can go crazy, it would cast a different light on this, I think, in hindsight. That's probably not something that I feel is very likely. But if we recharacterize it into this long-term thing, they chose, if it is something where they chose JJ McCarthy, well, they chose a 3-year arc, right? And the first year of JJ McCarthy didn't have to be better than the first year of Sam Darnold in Seattle for the Vikings to feel like they were on the right track. I think the standards were probably drawn differently, where you had to feel like he is getting there. And the goal is that by 2028, JJ McCarthy is a better quarterback than Sam Darnold, and whoever you're choosing to extend here, because in 2028, it's going to be a contract negotiation year for both of those guys, if I am doing my math right, or at least close to it. Maybe they're a year apart. But like whenever that contract in the late 2020s happens for both Darnold and McCarthy, that's when you look at it and say, okay, are they excited to sign this guy to a big giant mega deal, or are they letting him walk out of the organization? He's a backup by now to some other guy and we've totally moved on. Meanwhile, the Seahawks are happy to give a mega deal to their guy because he was a Super Bowl MVP 2 years ago, which is very possible here. And from that angle, it gets even harder to me to like justify this, because you didn't, like, how little did you know? How fake did you think the 2024 Vikings were that you were willing to basically throw that all in the garbage, call it a 1-year wonder, and not make a long-term commitment to it? The scenario they were afraid of, the scenario that stopped them from doing this, was the one where they got into a huge contract with Sam Darnold, big 3-year deal, and then he sucked in 2025, and now they're stuck in the contract. That's the scenario they didn't want to have. And I would say the scenario that they're in right now is probably preferable to that. Bad quarterback that you're paying is probably better than bad quarterback that you're not paying. And they already spent the draft pick on him either way, so that doesn't really change anything. At least they don't have the money tied up in him, right? And they can move on, or they can, use him as a Drew Lock-esque trade chip when they want to trade for a different guy or whatever. Like, it's fine. So how does this get salvaged becomes the next question. And the answer is you got to develop JJ McCarthy. But they also made the decision about JJ McCarthy with an assumption that the development apparatus that they had in place was going to make him better. And I would argue, and I argued all season, that it made him worse. And so it all funnels back into what is the main critique of the Vikings right now, which is that they failed to develop a young quarterback. And McCarthy is still very young. That can turn around. There's every chance in the world. He's going to get every chance in the world to turn it around and probably have to beat somebody in camp, but it might not even be that serious of a competition. So if by week 4 next year, McCarthy's playing fine and it's all going whatever, and they're, 2-2 and the Seahawks are like a 3-1 and it's whatever, and this will stop hurting as bad. But I guess I want to, before we move on to the defensive stuff, I want to leave you with this. There is no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for just whining about Sam Darnold playing well. If it does you harm that Sam Darnold is playing well and is in the big one and is like everybody's happy about it, and you're like sitting there in the corner with your arms crossed and you're harumphing about it, you are only dealing damage to yourself. This is one of those things where it's important to remind you that you aren't the Vikings. And that when the Vikings do something stupid, that doesn't mean that you are stupid. And I think we do that sometimes as fans of a team. We do that thing where we go, God, they screwed this up. Now I feel like I'm an idiot. And you're certainly not an idiot for believing in them. And I think that's one of the things about this like hindsight ass analysis that we're doing is Kevin O'Connell, like respecting Kevin O'Connell as a quarterback guy after the first 3 years of his tenure went the way that they went, was not incorrect. I really don't think that they were wrong to do that. And you show me somebody back then that was like, I don't think Kevin O'Connell's actually that smart about quarterbacks, guys. None of you said it. Nobody was saying it. And so I don't think it's fair to expect like Kwesi and the Wilfs to have known more about this than literally anybody in the world. Like, it's not fair to expect them to have seen the future in the way that nobody else could. Sometimes things are surprising. Sometimes a guy that you really have a lot of faith in blows it. Sometimes Tom Brady throws an interception. And that doesn't mean that suddenly the doubters of Tom Brady were right. It means he threw an interception. Get over it. So I guess I'll just leave it there. Yes, that is a bummer. The book on all of this is not fully written. For now, your best move is to get over it. Simply get over it. But let me change gears here a little bit, because the Vikings did get good news over the weekend. The Pittsburgh Steelers hired Mike McCarthy as their head coach. The Baltimore Ravens have hired Jesse Minter. Those are the two head coaching jobs that Brian Flores was in the running for. There are other unfilled vacancies, Cleveland, Arizona, Las Vegas, that are not considering Brian Flores right now, or maybe Brian Flores wasn't willing to consider them. For whatever reason, he hasn't made the list. There's nothing stopping them from adding him to the list, which is why I'm a little like, I'm not ready to like exhale until all the head coaching positions are filled and we like, no, for sure. No. But the reporting is that Brian Flores is coming back to Minnesota as the defensive coordinator. Of course, he signed his contract as the DC. So this like weird thing about him maybe going and being the DC of the Packers from the same people who now you have something real to whine about. So good for you, but we'll call it 99% chance. The only real scenario I can see that feels like it's not eliminated is the Buffalo Bills. They just fired Sean McDermott. They're still going through what their interview candidates are. Flores could be added to that list. We don't know yet. But once they start moving on to like second interviews, or they make a decision about who they're hiring, then we'll very much be in the clear in a practical way, and then in a super official formal way, not until all the head coaches are done. So Brian Flores is probably, we'll say, coming back, is in all likelihood coming back. What does that mean as the Vikings now move on to the next phase of their offseason, which is what are they doing in free agency? And we're going to talk a lot about free agency over the next couple of months, of course. But first, we should just establish what the goal needs to be and the problems of the defense that need to be solved, both from last season and problems that are going to be created now as players depart, and what kinds of players they should be looking at. I'm not going to give you any names. We're just going to try to establish what the needs are. We're making the shopping list before we go to the grocery store here. So that'll be next on Locked On Vikings. Today's episode is brought to you by Indeed. If you've ever hired somebody who has looked good on paper but wasn't the right fit, you know how important that is. When you want candidates who truly match what you're looking for, trust Indeed sponsored jobs. If I needed to hire somebody for my content, for example, I would go straight to Indeed and be very specific about what I need. Real experience, not just a resume buzzword. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to hire than non-sponsored jobs. You don't have to struggle to stand out. Their sponsored jobs will make sure that you are right at the top of the page for the person that you are looking to hire, for that kind of candidate. So spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results using Indeed sponsored jobs. Listeners of this show get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, do it the right way with Indeed. The Vikings depth chart, as it usually looks in January, is in a pretty bad way. They had to play a game tomorrow with all the players they had under contract for 2026. It would probably be pretty rough. But they aren't playing games tomorrow, which is, part of the deal. Part of the problem. They're not still playing football games. But there are a couple of, I would say, off-season priorities that the Vikings have, and I'm just focusing on the defensive side of the ball right now. Like at linebacker. The Vikings do currently have under contract next year Blake Cashman and Ivan Pace, and neither of those guys are very expensive. But Ivan Pace got benched this year, and those are the only linebackers they have under contract at all. Futures contracts notwithstanding, there's a couple of guys on futures contracts that probably won't make the team. So they need two linebackers in the room that are expected to be rosterable. that could be draft picks or whatever. I imagine part of the plan was supposed to be that one of those is Kobe King. They bungled that. So now they have Ivan Pace, Blake Cashman, and Vibes. Eric Wilson's headed to free agency. So I would say a priority is bringing back Eric Wilson, because the other thing is Eric Wilson got Ivan Pace benched. Ivan Pace got flat out thrown to the sideline over Eric Wilson and the way that he was playing. And he was playing phenomenally. It was one of those things where if Brian Flores were to leave for a head coaching job, I'd be a lot less excited about Eric Wilson. But I think Wilson has found a renaissance in his career as a versatile player, as a guy who can blitz as an overhang guy, play off-ball linebacker, mug the A-gap like he used to do in the Zimmer defenses. And being able to move that guy around helps to facilitate the other moving around, like with Van Ginkel or Dallas Turner that Flores is going to want to do. So I would say a huge priority is bringing back Eric Wilson. And that's not the first time I've said that on this show. But if you just look at the linebacker room, even after you have done that, you still need another guy. And again, maybe that's a 6th round draft pick can satisfy that. You need linebacker 4. This is not an expensive need. But with the Vikings pretty clearly declaring that they don't believe in Ivan Pace as a starting linebacker, I would say it is pretty reasonable to claim starting inside linebacker as a gaping roster hole, something that must be filled up before the draft. You need to have at least somebody that can compete with a rookie. If the Vikings go into the draft without this, with just what they have under contract right now, if they don't get a linebacker that is a real serious threat to take a starting job, then they are pigeonholed into drafting one. I think the need is genuinely that dire. And the problem is, this is not the only position group that I would say that about. Safety is in the same way. Josh Metellus is in the building. Jay Ward is in the building. Theo Jackson just signed a contract. Those 3 guys are in the building. Well, Theo Jackson is another player who got benched. Jay Ward has never been a starter. Josh Metellus is it. I'm not banking anything on Harrison Smith coming back, because even if he does come back, A, he's not actually under contract. He's not actually under contract. He's his contract voids out on March 13th, which is going to be a very big day for his retirement, by the way. I've been talking about this contract incorrectly. So there's like void year stuff that is happening with contract triggers. There's a lot of money that is banked into void years right now that will need to be paid as soon as Harrison Smith leaves the team. He needs to tell the Vikings what is happening by March 13th so that they can manage that contract, because they could theoretically sign Harrison Smith to a quote unquote 1-year extension with no pay raise and then release him post June, or not move him to the reserve retired list until June 1st. But they need to do something about that option in that void year, the void trigger, which happens on March 13th. So that's going to be a big day for Harrison Smith. But I'm not anticipating that he's going to be back, or that he's going to be back and also play well. He did not play well for a lot of this year. He was slow. He was the culprit on a lot of the stuff that went bad on the back end. And hey, it's a good defense when Harrison Smith is your problem, but the age has happened. It has caught up to him, and his ability to contribute is limited. So I would say that if the Vikings enter the draft with this safety group, it is a dire need, and they are priced into drafting him in the first round. So if it's that way for both linebackers and safety, guess what? Bad news. Something's going to suck this year. So I would say in free agency, they have to do something about that. Now, that could be bring back Eric Wilson, which probably won't be madly expensive. And safeties aren't madly expensive either. These are not super troubling needs to deal with, but they are very urgent. Cornerback, again, very urgent, like unbelievably so. Byron Murphy and Isaiah Rodgers are going to be back next year, or at least are under contract for next year. And I would imagine that the Vikings are happy enough with them to make them starters again. But that's literally it. I cannot stress this enough. I go insane about this every offseason. You go into camp with like 10 corners usually, because you need guys to do the one-on-one drills, and a ton of them get cut. There's usually undrafted free agents or 2 or 3 of those, right? Or futures contract guys. But even with futures contracts right now, Dwight McGlothern was waived this year. I think he was on a contract that would have renewed for next year, but is I think now that he's waived and he was brought back on the practice squad, I think he becomes a free agent. And like, that's it. So cornerback is another like extremely urgent need. Now you have your two top guys, so you probably only need one Shaq Griffin type to paper things over. Last year, that guy was Jeff Okudah, and it just didn't happen. So you went with 3 safety, but you don't have 3 safeties now because of the other problem. So everything is super thin. And I haven't even begun to talk about wanting a run stuffing D tackle in the middle. And I think on the D line, like if their starting 5 on D line was like Grenard, Van Ginkel, Jalen Redmond, Jonathan Allen, and then they kept Javon Hargrave, like as it stands going into the offseason, they do have a full room, not to mention Dallas Turner is part of that. Like they do have a full room, but there might be a cap casualty in there that creates a need. I would say Jalen Redmond and Jonathan Allen as your top D tackles is pretty exciting. I actually like that duo. I'm good with that. But you probably want a third guy that does more against the run. And again, you desperately need depth. So across this whole roster, there are a lot of things that the Vikings need. And with those needs, they need specific types of players, right? You can't just bring in any safety. You need a guy that has versatility, that can play in the box a little bit, can play deep a little bit. You can't just get any linebacker. You need somebody that has a little bit of pass rush prowess for these blitzes. You can't just bring in any D tackle. You're going to want somebody that's good against the run. So as this shopping list nears, I have 4 players on it because I don't think that you can do what you did in the run defense again and have a good defense again. I think teams are going to be too wise to that. So I want a run stuffing D tackle. I want a linebacker that has some formational versatility that can line up all over the formation and be interesting. I want a safety that I can say the same about. And I need a corner that can lock down on the outside and at least hold his own against wide receiver 2. That's a lot of stuff for a team that has cap issues going into the offseason. So you better hope we start fixing some, we start hitting on some draft picks and quick, which is really tough in the secondary and on defense. It's a really tight spot roster wise, and Flores is going to have to pull another rabbit out of his hat, man. But hey, at least he's here to do that. I will talk to you all tomorrow. Get me your questions in the Google form and the show notes. That's for Town Hall Tuesday. I'll see y'all for that. And as always, Skol.